Okay. That being said, I invite the Prime Minister to open the debate, defending the motion which stands in his name. Hear, hear.
Am I audible? Okay. The stance of opening government should be very clear. We think that when individuals did bad things in history, it does not negate the good they did. And similarly, if they do good, it does not negate the bad they did either. That is to say, George Washington owned slaves and it was wrong, but it does not negate his fundamental contribution to establishing democracy in the United States. Similarly for figures like Nelson Mandela, for political philosophers like Foucault, etc. I'll do a couple things in this speech. First, I'm going to talk about what this debate is about. Second, I'm going to give a principle about why you shouldn't negate individuals' legacies just because they did things which seemed right at the time, but we now recognize to be immoral. Third, I'm going to talk about how this interacts with the political realm. And lastly, I'm going to talk about how this affects our understanding of history and our own hubris. First, what's this debate about? It's not just an abstract debate. What we oppose on opening government is the recent trend to effectively cancel venerated historical figures because they did things like own slaves because, for example, they were sexist. What it means for someone's legacy to suffer is not just that you criticize them, but in the context of recent events, often to label these individuals as purely evil and self-motivated, where very little of the good they did matters because they did it for bad reasons. Now, we think that not only is this the most realistic and current conception of the debate, we think it's likely that once you start to let someone's legacy suffer, once you go beyond just criticizing their actions and saying their holistic impact on society should be negated, I think it's likely to see that you get over-cancellation, that you see very harsh reactions to these figures. I think first, because once this type of discourse is normalized, I think that the most controversial takes, the people who criticize venerated figures the most, are likely to get the more attention. And I think second, because if you have to push back against an immensely popular legacy like the legacy of Nelson Mandela, I think then you have to emphasize just how awful slaveholding or whatever bad they did was in order to actually convince people that their legacy doesn't matter to begin with. I'll take, oh, it's not a clarification. Okay, I want to talk about the principle. And the principle is basically this. Most people did not choose their own beliefs. This makes them culpable for those beliefs, but not evil. That is to say, doesn't negate their legacy. Why is this the case? The mechanisms are quite simple. I think that if you live, for example, in the 1800s or 1700s or 1600s, when slavery is normalized, you're exposed to continual social pressure to believe that slavery is okay, or to believe that women are inferior. We don't believe those beliefs are acceptable, but I think it's wrong to argue that people have a huge amount of personal choice over what they believe and don't. And like as an intuition check for this is why most individuals have almost the same political beliefs as their parents, is because people are instinctively trusting. It's a psychological phenomenon. If you tell them something over and over again, they're likely to believe it. This is why in debates, we make sure that all teams have the same amount of speaking time, right? Because the quality of arguments matters to some extent, a little bit less than how much time you have and I think, and so on forth. I also think that in these periods of time, if a belief was popular, it's likely because individuals weren't exposed to arguments against it. That is to say, voices which critiqued slavery were marginalized in society. They had less reach in newspapers. They were less likely to reach people in the Deep South, for example. I think that, by the way, this explains a lot of things that are happening today, like where most people don't think people don't even think about whether it's right or wrong to eat meat, even though animals probably do suffer. So what I think this means is that individuals are culpable for those beliefs. Of course, people are responsible for their actions, but it doesn't mean they're evil just because they believe them. It doesn't mean that everything they did was for self-motivated reasons. I think this means that principally you ought not to just negate their entire legacy because what they did not deserve that. What they were is intellectually lazy as opposed to deeply evil. I also want to talk about why this is particularly affecting individuals who are dead, who are historical figures. First, because when you're living, society can criticize or cancel you, and that is, in fact, the very process I have just discussed, which helps you shape and form new beliefs. And I think when you're dead, your actions are fixed. And second, I think when you're living, you have the opportunity to defend yourself, engage in discourse, which you don't have when you're dead. I'll take a POI from CO. Oh.
So what you're actually giving us in this debate is a complete mechanism that this is going to be entirely effective in them trashing their legacy completely.
I think that we're saying that, yes, their legacy will be trashed completely, and we're going to argue why that's bad, sure. Second argument about how this interacts with the political realm. I think the individuals that are relevant to this debate by nature are those who are venerated. It's past leaders of post-colonial regimes. It's the founding fathers of the United States. These people are the ones who are prominent by definition, because otherwise it wouldn't be worth taking the time to explain why what they did was wrong. I think that it's deeply divisive to attack the legacy of these people. I think often because they're seen as central to the birth of a nation. I think this has a couple of impacts. I think first, it damages the credibility of those who attack these individuals. That is to say, maybe it's really popular on the left in the United States to attack George Washington. But I think when you focus on doing things, I think you focus on basically symbolic gestures that don't have real impacts to society. So the San Franciscan School Board is removing founding father figures statues, but I think they should be spending their time talking about how to fund better schools, how to get rid of the disproportionate inequality in education today. I think also as more people buy into the legacy, they play it up, and as a result, there's not enough tension on real issues. I think that this type of discourse doesn't actually help people, it just changes historical narrative. I think second, this often fragments the political culture. That is to say, post-colonial regimes venerate Mandela despite the fact that he did bad things. And I think in the absence of this narrative, in the existence of this narrative, you're more likely to see states which are deeply divided ethnically, for example, crumbling, because the central identity of these states is founded around a core set of political beliefs. I think that when you attack these individuals, you necessarily tarnish their entire legacy, which includes the foundations of the state itself. I think this has a couple of impacts. I think first, it means that you're more likely to see ethnic conflict. You're more likely to see people like Modi sweep into power because people don't believe in constitutionalism. People believe that the Constitution is just the reality of real politics, and it doesn't really matter. And if Modi is popular, you ought to vote for him. I think it means in the United States, people similarly tarnish constitutional ideals. I think you're also more likely to get political polarization where two sides deeply disagree about these completely divisive issues and they can't actually pass real policies which help people. I think that this is unlikely to make a huge difference because these views are so polarizing in changing discourse. I think it's more likely to cause a nation to fragment. The last argument I want to talk about is why we're less likely to learn from history and why this attitude leads to hubris. I think first, the type of perhaps over-cancellation we have characterized means you're not likely to learn from intellectuals because, for example, a professor is scared of teaching Foucault because they know there's going to be immense backlash because Foucault's entire legacy is tarnished and the professor may be tarnished by association. I think these people were famous for a reason. I think we have a lot to learn from their political philosophy. And even if it's wrong, even if their views were tarnished by the society we live in, I think we can still learn something about how views evolve. I think second, this mindset leads to hubris. That is to say, unless you actually are empathetic to some extent with historical figures and recognize that there were reasons they did things that are wrong, you are more likely to believe that you yourself are infallible because you're not empathetic. You say, well, those people were obviously evil. I'm obviously on the right side of the issue. And for example, you're less likely to think critically about whether you should be vegetarian or not. I think you get better behavior on our side of the house. Very proud to propose.
We thank that speaker very much for those remarks. This House now recognizes the honorable and loyal leader of the opposition.
Can you please confirm that I'm clearly audible? Cool. I'm just setting my timer. Okay. I will be starting in 3, 2, 1. Literally the only thing opening government is correct about is that this debate has two prongs, principle and practical. I will prove both and integrate my rebuttal. On the principle, why is there fundamentally no right to legacy that these individuals can claim? And even if they can, why the right of the current generations outweighs that? First of all, note that the legacy of a historical individual is something which inherently structures society. The memories of these individuals are revoked and they're used to justify certain behaviors and certain moral patterns. They're used by political parties to structure their agenda and their political campaigns. Insofar as this is true, for example, the Tories instrumentalizing Churchill, this means that this legacy has a direct impact and actively affects lives of current generations. Insofar as that is true on a consequentialist basis, we have a larger moral prerogative to consent into this legacy than the dead person to the maintenance of this legacy. Why is this true? Because even if you assume that there is an equal right to the definition of fulfillment of each individual person, so the dead person and the current generations, this means we cannot weigh between these two moral actors a priori. We need to find another metric. At that point, the person affected more proximately by that legacy is the one with a larger moral prerogative. But note that opening government didn't even prove why we should consider this person a moral actor, because the reason why we value things like speech and like autonomy is because we believe they are conducive to moral goals, things like the pursuit of happiness and your ability to actualize your life. Insofar as this happened or did not happen on both sides of the house, and the dead individual is no longer a moral actor, it's unclear why even the principal basis of their argument stands. But secondly, it's impossible to make a normative claim about legacy. Why? Because we as individuals never have epistemic access to who another person actually is. We do not have access to the full repository of their memories, of their wishes and their desires and their true motivations. We always interact with an image and perception of another individual, cross-referenced with our experiences and our own moral frameworks. This means that fundamentally, it's impossible to say what legacy should and should not be, because a priori, each and every one of us interacts with an inherently different image of that person, because we have different, unchangeable and immutable experiences, and we do not choose those experiences nor how they influence our image of another person. Insofar as the starting positions are different a priori, it's impossible to establish what a legacy normatively should be, or should it suffer or not. And even if it were, it's ontologically impossible to access that. Trivially, this is why it's okay for us to say that people have different opinions of other people. I am the same person on both sides of the house, but Lover maybe thinks I'm awesome. Eric, maybe you think I'm horrible. I don't know, but we trivially consider all of these opinions are legitimate insofar as my argument is correct. But thirdly, even if these people knew that they would be tarnished by future generations, even if they had the choice to take this into account, they still willingly wouldn't have, and we can make this presumption. Because in the status quo in which they lived, they had political incentives not to do that. They had incentives to follow the current moral patterns, to perpetuate slavery, to perpetuate oppression, because this lended them power and because this lended them wealth. They did this and achieved that power and wealth, and they did this out of their own self-interest. So even if they had the chance to opt in, they would probably not opt in. But lastly, even if government proves in any way that there is an obligation towards this person and preserving their legacy, the obligation towards the self is always larger. Why? Because we always weigh obligations based on proximity. Trivially, we would agree that I have a larger obligation towards my family and friends than a stranger on the street. Why is this true? Because one, interactions. Not insofar as we have more interactions, we accrue more moral responsibility towards a particular person. The self is the person who you have most interaction with. You can never escape your internal monologue. You are always in dialogue and monologue with your thoughts. You are always encountering them and you can never escape them, which is that your interests and your desires are something you cannot flee from at any waking moment. Insofar as this is the person you're in perpetual interaction with, by proximity, the largest obligation to the self. But secondly, you are the person who your actions are affecting the most. Insofar as we weigh actions based on how much they influence other people, therefore even on a utilitarian basis, insofar as the largest impact of my actions is on myself, this means even if you buy utilitarianism, the current generations have a large obligation towards themselves rather than others. Even if you don't buy anything, I will continue to prove on the practical, this destroys any principle from the opening government and potentially closing government. And insofar as this motion is phrased as a normative claim, we have already won. Before that, I'll give closing government a chance to engage.
So specifically on the point that nobody can make any normative claims about legacy, this is not about the takeaway you have with that image, but about the image that should exist in the first place, which is why the principled logic itself is bunk.
I explained that there is no way to determine what image should or should not exist, because the positions that we start from are epistemically different, which means we have no access to an objective truth, because to do that, we would need to have an objective metric. Because we have different images and different experiences, it's unestablishable what that metric is. Since ontological truth exists, you cannot prove it on your side of the house. On the practical, what does open government contend? They say there will be huge backlash, there will be tarnishing and stuff like this. First of all, in terms of their division claim, this division exists a priori, because how does the motion manifest? It's people taking down statues, it's people rebelling like roads must fall and things like that. The people doing that are largely oppressed groups. So this happens in societies where the division is prior to the protest. In South Africa, you have ethnic tensions because the whites are the minority, but they still hold most of the wealth and discriminate against the rest of society. In Britain, you still have everyday discrimination towards Black individuals or LGBTQI individuals. This is why they're rioting, because they're not satisfied with their lives and want to send a symbolic message. This exists prior. But secondly, on over cancellation, first of all, unlikely to happen, because if what they say is true and these people have a huge legacy, then it probably means that movements have an incentive to not frame this as we hate him, but rather he was a good president, but he also did bad things. Professors will still teach Foucault because everyone likes Foucault, but they will say, look, Foucault did bad things, we should keep that in mind. But even if they prove over cancellation, we still win. Before I explain why we win on the practical, I will take opening.
Yeah, so this argument, like closing, identifies as a normative debate. It's not about what one individual chooses. Why does any of your arguments about proximity and like beliefs in the self matter?
You gave the same POI as opening, like closing. Like I literally gave the response to this. Why do we win on the practical? First of all, we see this is a rallying point for the movement. It is a strong symbolism. You take down a symbol of oppression. This creates a visual perception that you're making inroads into something. And this creates a point of creation of the movement. Why? Because it's hard to create movements in the long term. What does this do? This gives simple messaging, a clear goal, because the goals of movements are often very broad and hard to buy into. But when you give a clear goal, the goal of roads must fall is eliminate roads from Oxford. This is a very clear goal, a simple goal you can explain to people. In the process of that, you're more likely to be able to socialize people within the movement, and then in the long term, get them to be activists, to petition, and things like that. Secondly, we see this provides more political information because backlash is uncomparative, as I explained. People who backlash believe that the actors committing this have malicious incentives a priori. Like Christians will always believe that abortion is a spawn of devil. People will always believe that an ethnic group discriminated against is wrong. The people who are comparative is those not socialized into the political system. When this happens, you do not know what's going on. A Churchill statue has just been taken down. You read about this. Media reports on this. They report in the background. Members of these movements give statements on why they think this is wrong and why they think particularly happened in the situation. This means that in the long term, you get more information seeping into the political system, more information for people to interact with. What does this mean? This means, first of all, we get more awareness of the pervasiveness of discrimination within our society. But secondly, we destroy the ability of political parties to use emotional appeal because they appeal to these figures in order to be able to run their political campaigns better. At the point where we inform people about what has actually happened and why these people were not necessarily morally good or bad, this means we destroy the capacity of parties to act towards people's emotions and cater more towards their policy preferences. For all of these reasons, we say opening opposition wins this debate.
We thank that speaker very much for those remarks. And this House now recognizes the Deputy Prime Minister. Hear, hear.
Can everyone hear me? Cool. I think the best case for opening opposition is one that they want to fiat magically. The idea that just because you agree on cancellation, everyone agrees on it, and maybe if they don't, at least you talk about it a little bit more. And I think the responses and the argument about backlash is just woefully uncomparative. It is not true that every Christian just views abortion to be a moral harm. It is not true that every American just thinks, oh, George Washington, really great. So it is good that you have a nuanced view of historical figures. The import of what Asher tells you is that it is very, very hard to do this when you are trying to tear their legacy down. I want to talk more specifically in the pragmatics as to why you have to over-cancel people and why, even if you don't, it doesn't matter. First, I want to talk about the principle. And before all of that, I want to talk about the states that I think this is just the most important in. And I don't want to shift the debate too much, but I actually do think that post-colonial states, like states that have like novel state regimes, this is the most important group. And the reason why is because I think it is actually very, very bad when there is a set of people that buy into the narratives that support people and a set of people that buy into the narratives that don't support people. That is to say, I think opening opposition is sometimes correct. This cancellation is never 100% effective. What that does is create massive division. And see, the problem is when opening opposition identifies the racial divisions that predate these historical figures that predate colonialism, that is terrible. The division between who in Kenya thinks Jomo Kenyatta is good and who in Kenya thinks Jomo Kenyatta is bad is divided along ethnic lines. That is to say, the Kikuyu tribesmen that he supports are overwhelmingly more likely to favor him. The other people buy into the narrative of cancellation. And I want to be clear about why I think this is so terrible, something they just don't engage with. Because despite what any of these post-colonial new state regime leaders did in their worst instances, that is, Jomo Kenyatta did the one-party rule, didn't support the Mau Mau uprising, Kwame Nkrumah didn't support all the multitude of minorities that were in Ghana fully, Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore has one-party rule. All of these figures have something greater than them. And this is the important thing, because when you venerate them, it is not the bad things that you venerate. It is the good things that they did. It is the birth of a nation. It is the Pan-Africanism and liberation in Ghana. Uniform cults of personality, I think, are very, very good, because what it does is it manifests that you can transcend social divisions when you rally around a certain people. So in Ghana, the Akan and Mole Dagbon, like minorities, are able to unify around the concept of like Kwame Nkrumah supporting Pan-Africanism rather than tearing down his legacy, because the racial divisions that tend to exist due to the legacy of post-colonial states, that is either the artificial generation of racial identity, i.e. Rwanda, or the divide and rule tactics that are very, very frequent everywhere from India to all of Southeast Asia. What you see is you see massive racial divisions being like there in the counterfactual. And I think the counterfactual, the most damaged places that you see right now are the ones that are unable to unify along mass historical figures. This is Rwanda, where like the absence of a truly venerated figure, that is to say, like you had some guy like Kalibandi, but like the absence of a truly venerated figure and someone you uniquely rally around was why the RPF under like Habriyama, like apologies if I'm mispronouncing their names, like for any of the names, but I think that's when the RPF takes over, because the vast majority of people do not see something like idealistic. I want to explain why this only happens on our side. There is just a veneration of leaders that I think is uniquely smoothing of racial tensions, because you look to Nelson Mandela and you aspire to be him. You look to Jomo Kenyatta and you aspire to meet his definition of what it took to be visionary, of what it took to have success in the Kenyan countries. That is the only point in which you're actually able to at least try to address the racial tensions, because even if they did terrible things, there are unifying things that you tap into that are very, very good to have. The counterfactual, if opening opposition is correct, is just far worse, because the kinds of people that agree or disagree with what the legacy tearing down, what that actually happens, means you create much more division. I think the second thing that they just don't engage with is the fact that this gives credence to those who target the institutions and who target the documentation of states. So it is opposition parties in like Ghana saying the constitution isn't good because Kwame Nkrumah wrote it and he was a terrible person, and tearing apart the constitution as a result. And I think this is just genuinely important. Here is why this is important. The vast majority of places where people are canceled, that is to say, where opening opposition's impacts are true, society has already made an agreement that the actions they took were bad. That is to say, in the United States, we all agree slavery was bad, and people who support George Washington obviously don't. But the difference is that in these states, you are canceling them for something that is at best uncertain, and at worst creates to more and more division between different groups that believe different things.
If there is a sufficient critical mass to take down Mandela's statues and tarnish his reputation, and this is enough to be relevant for your impacts, surely he's a priori not a unifying figure?
No, see, because that's the whole point. It's not like everyone uniformly supports these. Think about it in America, where like people who take down George Washington statues aren't like the majority of people. They're small independent groups that are like, that's a statue of Frederick Douglass, that's a statue of Ulysses Grant, let's take it down. It's a mob mentality. And actually, I do want to talk about this because I think it's very, very important. See, the argument that Asher gives is it's not like society en masse is canceling people. It's small groups of people that are trying to be woke, and more importantly, they're trying to outwoke each other. So when you say that one person did something bad, my instinctual response is to compete. That is to race to the bottom on which historical figures are the worst. This is why in Atlanta, when they took down statues of Ulysses S. Grant, who marched and burned down the South in order to support in order to support African Americans. So you get a mad rush and almost a mob mentality. The reason that Asher identifies for this is, and the reason it beats opening opposition's mechanism over cancellation, is because when you have to attack the whole legacy of these very, very important figures, you attack them really harshly. Closing, do you have a POI? Okay, I want to talk about information, but very quickly, I want to identify that if opening opposition thinks that people are just so uniformly bad, that doesn't matter, because by that time, society has already agreed that their bad things were bad. And I just don't think they give you an impact as to why it is terrible to venerate George Washington. If you already agree that the stuff that he did was terrible in that vein, you can still talk about the good thing that he did. The information argument, I think, is weak here, because the problem is, I just do not think they give you analysis as to why you don't feel fear talking about these things. This is a professor that doesn't teach Foucault out of fear of being canceled by their class, because Foucault is a canceled figure. It is a professor not willing to teach Kant because they are afraid of being rejected by their university for not falling in line with the problematic standards. Lastly, on the principle, which I think is just far less important, because people can't eat principles, and war kills a lot of people and principles just don't. The problem with their argument about why society has used you is this is exactly why society has committed harms on you. The obligation of society, therefore, is not to blame the dead person, but to take responsibility for its wrongs. And the reason this motion is a good thing rather than their side, which is a moral wrong, is because one, it blames people for the beliefs that society imputed on it, and two, society takes no actual responsibility for their own problems. At best, they give you an argument of descriptive claims. The premise of the motion is quite literally, we don't think the legacy is good, we should change it. If you believe in their non-interventionist principle about descriptive claims, that is exactly why you reject their stance. Very, very proud to propose.
We thank that speaker very much for those remarks. This House now recognizes the Deputy Leader of the Opposition. Hear, hear.
Can you hear me? Okay, awesome. I'll start very soon. What you should have read the motion. You need to defend George Washington is a good president, period. Robert E. Lee was a great military leader, period. Churchill was a great statesman, period. Rhodes was a philanthropist, period. No buts on your side of the house. You need to defend their legacy as it is right now. I think that the framing that comes from open government is very not true in this debate. This is obviously individual. Legacy is differently trashed. In most cases, it ends up being more nuanced than they claim. Humans whose legacy is questioned by requests of these movements, please note that CG cannot run too much on polarization or social fabrics tearing because what OG ran, they at best can agree that this is nuanced as it actually is. These people already have people who, support their legacy in the status quo, meaning that similarly with the discourse argument, like when you see statues all the time, this puts people on pedestal. When you learn about history all of the time, about how these people were heroic, this puts people in the pedestal. So the comparative on our side of the house is that the legacy is put more so where it should be, and not that it is completely trashed, because there's canto of people on the other side who want the legacy to remain as it were in the status quo, right? This is why on our side of the house, when you have actors who fight against this, it is actually a more nuanced sort of legacy, and I will prove that later in the argumentation. But remember about backlash. I mean, this always happens. It happens even with ideas about these people. Idealization is what happens on their side of the house. But for example, BLM is bad because it doesn't like our police officers, because it doesn't like heroes in blue, because they'll kneel when our national anthem is playing, because they're unpatriotic. So the backlash that they are talking about is not comparative in this debate to the extent that you also engage in trashing the legacy of these folks. But also recognize the principle in this debate, which is really important. Legacy is always subjective and depends on who gives it, right? Empirically, I might think that Churchill is horrible from Burke's perspective, but also subjectively in terms of epistemic access. No one has an inherent right to legacy. Therefore, people have a more right to consent to perpetuating of this legacy, more so than the person who has the continuation of this legacy. This is the asymmetry of impact, but this is also the importance of issues. Post-World War II, I thought the most important thing was beating Nazis. Now I think most important thing is racism and colonialism that Churchill actually progressed. This is the comparative thing that we are talking about, how people's preferences shift, and this is the reflection that we get under this side of the house. But also recognize how we go even a step further here. If you had the choice as Churchill or any of these figures to opt into being liked by the generation of the 21st century or your generation, you would opt into being liked by the people who lived at that time, even though you knew that later on we would think these things are immoral and they are wrong, because you would have liked the people of your age to give you power, to give you legacy. And like indeed, these people had untarnished, untouched legacy for decades and even hundreds of years in some of the cases. So the balance of the harms and how we value legacy and how we value the ability of people to have their agency and to change their legacy is already tilted towards their side of the house a lot. And we are at least to some extent retaking this symmetry back. I want to talk about how this happens and movements, because they put a lot of, I think, unrealistic comparatives here. You remove statues, you talk about their crimes, you remove them from pedestal, you talk more about in education, but also people get informed about this. This is put like on Instagram pages, this is put on media, so people engage with the atrocities that happened. You trashing a person also makes you think about what was the systemic actions that took place there. If I trash the person who was the king of Belgium in Congo, and they did all sorts of bad policies, I inherently read about what we were doing as Belgians to Congo. And this is the change comparatively on the movement that we get. But recognize from the perspective of the movement, this trickles down to the individual of the movement. This is an ideological focal point of the movement, a thing that they agree on, thing that gives them fuel and energy to incentivize protest, petitioning to change, puts the focus on what happened before and how people were harmed and how this impacts the status quo right now. This is a thing that glues together movements and that enables them to have ideological symmetry and ideological consistencies where this matter. I want to take closing opposition, and then I want to give you specific impacts that we have.
Assuming you said closing government, it seems to me extraordinarily unlikely that assuming society had the same political capital on both sides, that they would stop caring about these issues on either side. Like, it seems to me that this specific impact doesn't really change by taking down a statue.
Like, we have all seen how people mobilize against these things. We have seen how people actually take part, how this is important. And I think if they run backlash against these things, then there is an impact here. I think I mechanized this enough. What are the impacts? This allows society to progress forwards the priorities of past legacies. There will always be people who are still in the mindset that this person was right. There will be institutions that will support this. There will be conservatives who think that you are literally apatriotic and you don't like your country because you're talking about this. This oftentimes includes fake nostalgia about good old times, or includes prioritizing past historical happenings that people like beforehand. This is a way forward forward for each and every generation to establish their own criteria of what they think is important for a person to give legacy. Pragmatically, this is the young outvoting the old, therefore prioritizing the important focus points of society towards what is most important to them and not to the person whose life is ending or already ended. The second impact is that this factually prioritizes the perspective of people who were the ethnic minority back then, because people who were put these people on legacy and pedestals are people who were largely men, heterosexual, in position of power to unify the country under one religion, as opposed to what opening government is saying, under one ethnicity, race, etc. This inherently changes because of the change in demographics and empowering of the groups who are now criticizing the unification that happened under one religion or one ethnicity that they are able to, that they need to support, and they're actually supporting this debate. Like it's good that we are unified, but no one cares about that you don't have rights because you're not of the ethnicity of the person who unified our country. I want to take OG.
The current trend is not to be nuanced, it is to tear down their statues and remove them from curricula. OO's focus argument is exactly why the movement focuses on performative over real action on things that everyone has already agreed are bad.
No, this is your perspective because you are OG in this motion. Even if the movement itself is not nuanced, the political decision-making is nuanced, which means that you're not going to cater to all of the things that the movement asks, but you have the other side, and you're going to drive the middle road, which is a better road, a road of actually doing some reforms, actually helping society. So you're going to say, oh, the Confederacy was bad, everyone who died under the banner is like a very immoral person, but you are going to tear down these statues and replace them with Black Lives Matter, not Black Lives Matter, but like, for example, the movement in the 60s figures, like black activists and things like this, as we have seen the consequence of this policy actually happening. The last impact that we want to put forward this debate, victims of these policies are legitimized in their struggle. No one talked about this before because it was apatriotic. You shouldn't talk about this because you're trashing Churchill and he fought the Nazis. So why are you talking about that he starved millions of people like in Burma or whatever? But like this legitimizes their struggles. They're helped in their effort to put truth to power, and this enables a path for states to redeem them for previous harms because people know about the struggles that were committed against them, because there's a movement that fights for these struggles to be redeemed. And this is a consequence of the policy of questioning and challenging the legacy of the people whose legacy was not challenged before. We give you a principle why this is more important that you challenge, that you don't challenge. And we give you pragmatical impacts, what this changes people's lives in the present for the better, and we prioritize with this is the most important thing. Thanks.
We thank that speaker very much for those remarks. This House is now pleased to recognize the member of government.
Hi, am I audible? Great. Yeah, I'll take POIs in the chat. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The easiest way to kill a dream is to kill its hero. 2 novel substantives coming from closing government. First, we will explain that this converts political capital into a specifically unuseful and unmeaningful political capital that kills generally dissent and generally socially important things. Secondly, we also think that this as an ideological tool in terms of criticizing and tarnishing a person's legacy is applied unequally and specifically harms vulnerable groups more than those in power and those who are majority. Just to briefly pre-frame these arguments, how does this beat out opening government? First, on the level of engagingness, I think it's pretty clear OO is probably taking down OG, and so we're immediately more engaging. But I also think it takes a harder principled burden, which is that it explains what, like, even if it is the case that we don't care about the principled obligation we might have to this person's legacy or who this person is, like, we will explain the more salient impact as to whether or not this affects people in the present generation, that is to say, those who are alive right now and can still suffer. First argument, we think that the top half debate does not separate itself from the broader critique against these immoral beliefs. Like, the critique remains on both sides. We find it extraordinarily unlikely that the only reason we found slavery to be deplorable was because we said George Washington was bad. Instead, we think the tarnishing of a historical figure's legacy has a totalizing effect on the discourse surrounding these issues, in that it locates blame squarely on the framework of an individual. In terms of colonialism, it might blame it on the person that colonized you specifically, such as Magellan or Christopher Columbus. This is for 4 structural reasons. The first is that it is substantially more persuasive than any alternative narrative, in that it is extraordinarily hard to defend an individual for doing a slavery, right? For the reason that, as opening says, societal consensus is quite persuasive and hard to challenge. Additionally, since it is located within the narrative and structure of an individual, it's far easier to understand this versus a more diffuse understanding of a broad social issue. Secondly, self-selection. To uncover these immoral actions, you have to peer more into their personal lives and very personal details like their diaries and their journals, etc., which means that you uncover reasons to believe that this person specifically was intrinsically evil. Thirdly, to cancel one specific person's legacy, not only do you have to shift media strategy, which itself is something that is highlighted, you also have to put more media attention on highlighting that this person was uniquely and relatively more immoral even within their society. So by hypothesis, it means we impose a spotlight on this specific individual relative to others. Fourthly, it also presumes ill intent in their conduct, singling out this person's motivations as intrinsically evil, as opposed to being set against the backdrop of a greater evil society. How does this argument deal with opening opposition? First, I think opening opposition has an intelligent preemption here, which is that, it helps people learn more about these things, and that they will learn more about this issue in general. But the question is not whether or not they will choose to read about it, since in both sides, the political capital can be exerted to, tell people to read up on certain things and have certain campaigns. But we think the distinction is in what form this political capital is converted to. We think the way this political capital is exerted is one that is exceedingly unactionable. This is why movements that take down statues stop at the statue and are still born on the pedestal of a dead dream. It is why these individuals stop at the legacy, because you cannot go back in time and change people's minds and undo a legacy that happened. At best, you might be able to exert some reparation, but it does not mean that you fix the actual structural issues that happen in society. We think a hypothetical counterfactual would substantially change the kinds of political capital mobilized in two ways. The first is, since it is substantially less divisive, as opening government says, so we're weaponizing this impact. We think the crucial thing here is that you can have bipartisan agreement in that both people can agree, even if they might disagree on the specific of that particular leader, and they can agree on an action. But secondly, it widens the vista of possible policy platform and reform in the first place, because it means that we can distance ourselves from changing legacy things, which might not meaningfully change a person or an individual's perception about a certain thing, but can tangibly improve the life of another individual through a separate policy proposal. Before I move on, I'll take a POI from OO, since no one else has raised one.
Rhodes Must Fall movement has done more for the equity in the Rhodes Scholarship than any Rhodes Scholarship is not equitable movement could have done, exactly because of marketing, PR, and how people get incentivized to move into these things.
I guess it's a good point, but I'm assuming the argument by hypothesis says that a hypothetical counterfactual would do substantially better. So that doesn't actually take down the argument we've made. Anyway, secondly, we think also that this tool is used in an ideological way, and it's one that is applied unequally. So regardless of whether or not top half generally thinks it's good or bad to have these things, if we can explain that it specifically harms a vulnerable group in the present day disproportionately, then we're winning this debate. So why is it applied unequally? We think generally figureheads of social movements and historically significant people, such as Gandhi, who was in an arranged marriage, or tribal leaders and chieftains who themselves engaged in tribal raids and internecine conflict as expected for the time, are specifically criticized and challenged by consensus society. As a tool, it is used to pick away at the legitimacy and ideals for which many of these people stand, but more importantly, many of the people in the present day seek to uphold for themselves, for three structural reasons. The first is that people in power have substantially more resources to perpetuate a particular ideological stance, whether it be through the media tools that they might have to extend their belief over other individuals, or secondly, through their control over legitimacy and seeing who is right? That is to say, the determination over educational institutions, who is seen as a national hero, the national curricula, social capital, and the perception that they are the legitimate knowledge holders. It's why white supremacists can call out I don't know, people who basically it can call these people savage, they can call these people terrible, because in the past the people that they descended from also did these savage things that were expected for the time. But it's not like you're going to see any of the founding fathers removed from any of their places of power, realistically speaking, on a national stage. So we think that this access to these academic institutions means that this tool ideologically is applied unequally. What are the meaningful consequences in this real world? And again, as I'd like to highlight, still no POIs in chat, so hopefully it's not a serious flaw. So here, you might be tempted to respond by saying that the narrative of social discourse skews. I'll take a POI from. It's too late. Never mind. Okay, skews towards the powerful always. Thus, here are some reasons for why this specific discourse harms vulnerable groups the most, as opposed to just leaving it equal in general. So insofar as any movement needs a figurehead or a person to rally behind, it is these groups, that is to say, the most vulnerable, those who are in positions of minority, those who are in positions of socioeconomic disparity the most. These criticisms affect these groups disproportionately way more than anyone else. Why? One, they need these people the most because they they are inspired by them. We use our legacies to define ourselves, our beliefs, and our activism. It may be cold hard facts that push someone to rally on the street, but it is the mantle of a legacy that pushes them to keep walking. In societies where it is exceedingly difficult to remain hopeful, it is the legacy of a person that tells you it is possible, obtains it, and kills this dream. Secondly, moreover, it is far harder for you to unite as an individual since we use legacies to arrange ourselves into movements and renegotiate group identity. But thirdly, it also makes it far harder to unlock people that would otherwise join your movement, because now the people who cannot articulate their beliefs in the vocabulary of their politics have their heroes killed because of the fact that they're too problematic to believe in. Why does this outweigh everyone else? First, it explains why people that are most disprivileged in society lose the vocabulary and tools to articulate themselves and their activism. But moreover, it specifically explains to you why, even if this might generally be closer to the truth or the epistemic axis of opening opposition, why it is simply unacceptable and thus must be opposed. But I guess we're proposing the motion, so propose this. Thanks.
We thank that speaker very much for those remarks. This House now recognizes the member of the opposition.
Am I audible? Yes. 3, 2, 1. Arguments about culpability are out of this debate. From opening government, we do not care about culpability because culpability determines the legacy, determines the legitimacy of inflicting suffering on individuals who are still alive. These individuals are dead and they cannot suffer. Therefore, we do not care about culpability. On opening opposition's contentions about the morality of this, I think that even if we can't have ontological access to these individuals' true selves, we can still say that someone's legacy should suffer if there's a consequentialist goal that would be furthered by having that legacy suffer. And thus, opening opposition's like 50% of their material about how it's not moral to make these individuals suffer is depending upon them proving the maximal consequentialist reason why these individuals' legacies should suffer. On closing government's contention as to the consequentialist benefits of not having these people's legacies suffer, their claim is that this is used to chip away at these individuals' legacies, so chip away at the legacy of MLK, thereby delegitimizing the movements that advocate for them today. The problem is this, that the problem with this is that the conservative elite that they say is going to do this is more closely represented by these individuals' worst qualities that they say will be used to delegitimize these individuals. So I'm very unclear why a racist conservative elite pointing out that somebody is racist delegitimizes the movement more than it delegitimizes the individuals making that critique themselves. We think that these movements can rather say that they are perfecting these individuals' legacies, removing the bad bits and improving the legacy over time by carrying through the narrative of the good without the narrative of the evil. On opening government's claim about identity fragmentation in the developing world, what they neglect is that the legacy of Kenyatta is good among some individuals, but already and in their world regardless, toxic among others, regardless of what the public official view of the legacy is. What these figures' legacy is about the public zeitgeist and public conception of these individuals. So often within marginalized communities, they often still understand the moral evils that these individuals committed, but they often feel like they are not adequately represented in the public narratives around these individuals. So where you genuinely get ethnic individuals not opting into a narrative is when they see that narrative as not reflecting the fact that this individual inflicted active suffering upon them. Opening government would require you to believe that these individuals just are unaware of the horrible aspects of these individuals' pasts. Opening opposition says that this division pre-exists, but we show why ignoring the fact that this division pre-exists leads to the same active harms that opening government is talking about. But our extension is going to go much further than that. Specifically, our extension is going to claim that legacies should be tarnished because the only mechanisms through which we can prevent the legacies from being tarnished is for us to commit moral evils in the present. What do I mean? How are we going to stop a legacy from suffering when the moral views of society change? Naturally, people would come to view those individuals as worse human beings because because they have views that are more different from the norm. So to claim that these individuals' legacies shouldn't suffer is to claim that we would be doing something wrong if we allowed these individuals' legacies to naturally suffer as they would over time, which implies that we should do something to stop this. So that is the necessity of the government claim. So how do schools teach history? How do museums present history in their side of the house in order to prevent individuals' legacies from being tarnished over time? 3 ways they do this. First is erasure. You don't talk about the evil. You ignore that Gandhi supported apartheid in South Africa and had vile views towards the Muslim population. You neglect that Columbus committed mass genocide for years in your history books. Why is this harmful? Firstly, it alienates members of those marginalized communities who feel that their history is invisible, that they are invisible, that no one cares about them. Their deaths of their ancestors aren't even worth a mention in your classroom textbook. This is awful for individuals. It inflicts an active cycle of harm on these individuals today that government needs to justify. But secondly, it reduces awareness about the past harm. You're less aware about those past harms, and thus you're also less aware about the implications of those past harms today. You're less aware about how the legacy of slavery continues to perpetuate and deprives access to opportunities for African Americans in the United States. And if you're less aware of this as a popular culture, you're less able to take measures to adequately address this end outcome, which is why we think it's taken so long for discussions like reparation to even get off the ground. But if you don't do erasure, you then have to do something else, which is rationalization. Well, it wasn't actually that bad, even if we talk about it. What does this look like? This looks like saying Churchill leading to a massive famine in Bengal is on net okay because the UK benefited India because at least we gave them civilization and the railways. There are literally questions in textbooks around the world justifying the moral evil that countries have committed on other individuals in an attempt to rationalize why their leaders are still good overall. Why is this harmful? Firstly, it is a moral evil in and of itself to say that this wasn't as bad as it actually was. Opening government.
Elites don't cancel historical figures. These are bottom-up movements that criticize those in power. So CG's out.
Yeah,
When you have to spend your time criticizing these people, that's what you do with all your time, all your resources. You don't do any other social change.
No, well, our case is what specifically happens when you try to prevent the natural tarnishing from occurring, which is what you're going to have to do. So the reason why cancel culture has occurred is because we haven't done actively morally evil things. The only way to prevent those things from occurring is what I'm talking about, and doing that would be an act of moral evil. So rationalization is in of itself a moral atrocity, but also I think it perpetuates harmful narratives. It says that colonialism wasn't actually net bad for the developing world, which means that there isn't as much obligation that individuals have today to right those past wrongs. But the third way that you could alternatively do this is that at Gov's best case, you could teach the moral trade-off. Closing government.
So I just want to point out our extension already explains why many of these broader criticisms still exist, but instead what happens is you centralize these harms on these specific individuals as opposed to the broader social issue.
No, I already dealt with your extension. Your extension doesn't make any sense. At Gov's very best, they teach the moral trade-off. So you don't ignore it, but what you do is you teach a moral framework that justifies these individuals' legacies not being tarnished. What does that framework look like? It looks like a framework that says that moral good of a certain kind, moral good of the kind that's recorded in history books, moral good of the kind that makes you an historical figure, is enough to give you reverence, even if you inflict moral evil on those without a voice, even if you inflict moral evil on those who aren't powerful in that society. And what this says to individuals who are currently alive, when you teach this in the classrooms, when you embed this as the moral framework that they have when they're growing up and forming their identities, is that what we care about as a society is the good to the majority. It's the good to those who have the pulpits, and it's the good to those who can write the history. But this ignores the fact that it commits moral evil on individuals. It wipes that away. It trains individuals not to care about those kind of moral harms. It trains them that those people don't matter, and when people bring up those harms, they shouldn't listen. The only ways you can avoid these people's legacy from being tarnished is to do an evil again today, and that is reprehensible. Proud to oppose.
We thank that speaker very much for those remarks. This House is now pleased to welcome the government whip. Hear, hear.
Hello, testing a microphone. Can I be heard properly? All right, thank you. Hello everyone. My name is Luigi. My preferred gender pronouns are he, him, they. If you have any POIs, you can raise it in the chat. I'll watch the chat for all of your POIs. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, and go. History is actually not just written by the victors. History divides people's legacies between winners and losers, between the rich and the poor, between the powerful and the powerless. And particularly, it starts by ripping apart the memories and legacies of the most sidelined by history. Remember, this conception of morality by virtue of opening opposition is obviously not universal. But what we argued from closing government, it is rather privileged. It is Western-centric and it is elitist in its application. Our case is not out of this debate. In the Philippines, we have so many leaders that we try to hold on to, like so whole leaders that we can only hold on to right now. Our first president ordered summary executions. Our national hero had sexist writings and beliefs. Many scientists also had many racist beliefs that also led to eugenics. But we still hold on to these leaders and people that we can point to in our society because there are ideals that are greater than squabbling about these personal information or these information that tries to continuously vilify and take away of the contributions of these leaders in society. I'm going to focus on 3 things in this speech. Number 1, the future of legacies and closing opposition. Number 2, why it is important that these legacies remain stable in opening opposition. And lastly, the opening government and what the conditions in which this legacy is tarnished. Firstly, on the future of legacies. Yoda once said, "We are what they grow beyond." That is the burden of all masters. Closing opposition tries to say and presume that these legacies should always be completely tarnished, that we otherwise, controversial leaders, are never going to be talked about in schools. Otherwise, they're never going to be tried to critically examine many of these leaders over and over again. I have 2 points of rebuttal against this. Number 1, this is again, as every other team in this debate has talked about, not a debate about whether or not we should actively vilify or celebrate any leaders in general. It is a debate about whether specific immoral actions that are not taken in context from their society should be allowed to tarnish significant portions of this person's legacy. And I think most of the examples the previous speaker talked about are not part of that, that matrix of information. I'm sure many of the unnecessary moral evils of Hitler, for example, and conduct that he made in different countries, or for example, the nuclear bombs in Japan, can be justified by some side, but obviously is morally unjustifiable by the times even in that period. Or for example, the genocide by Columbus obviously is immoral because it was genocide, and by most metrics in society would have been vilified even then. But I want to be very clear, in the vast majority of cases where this actually takes place, where there is disagreement on the morality of these decisions, the gray area absolutely becomes worse, and it is unfairly applied, particularly against many of these heroic figures. That's why the second thing I want to highlight is this. Even if this is true, your criticisms significantly get outweighed in the vast majority of immoral circumstances that are gray, such as the arranged marriages for civil rights activists for people for many civil rights activists from India, or for example, sexist and racist beliefs for people like Albert Einstein, for example, or different people in the past, or like the examples I provided to you earlier, like Emilio Aguinaldo or Andres Bonifacio. For these individuals, there is no recompense. There is no ability for them to be seen as a morally ideal person or someone that could be preferable in their direction of their movement and the direction of their ideology, and therefore the ability for you to highlight and be able to associate any movement and any pursuit towards reform and social change today becomes significantly outweighed by any evil that any other people in power can point to. That's why it gets significantly worse. That's why the future of legacies becomes disproportionate and unfair, and even if there are many disagreements, it is very, very hard for you to mobilize at all if you don't have any leader to point to. Now I'm going to focus on opening up, but before that, something the POI.
Even if we neglect that this doesn't work by attacking the individual, but rather the acceptance of their legacy. Know that being active in a movement requires sacrifices in terms of time, emotional health, and even physical safety. The bar to people joining movements is quite high. They're therefore only likely to do that when they have a clear ideology and goal to rally around, which allows them to be socialized in the movement long term, which both of us give in our speeches.
Yeah, no. It's very clear that the particular actions of targeting the immoral actions of these individuals and tarnishing their legacy is very personal, and the association to these leaders and the ability for them to participate in these movements is also highly personal. For example, when you are peering into the diaries of Jose Rizal or people like Washington and his opinions on slavery, you are definitely going into the personal ideology of this individual rather than looking onto the public text and public acts that he was able to do in writ large in the contributions to the Constitution. So in those respects, respects, I think the arc of justice bends towards our side, and that's why we win. Why is it important then that legacies remain stable in opening opposition? Opening opposition says that because legacies change over time and preferences change over time, legacies can rise and fall like the tides in the wind, and that is a good thing. We said it is good that legacies remain stable for the following reasons. Number one, the glorification of these leaders becomes less personal and idol-like in our world, and instead it becomes more ideological and idealistic. Your side makes it harder for any movement to find justification in their participation because the people they vilify or the people they support and really, really love in society, like Martin Luther King, like Gandhi, for example, simply continuously get berated and taken away, such that you feel that your participation in the movement also gets delegitimized. But number two, the retellings of these legacies can evolve and also show this direction of change in how these legacies carry on in the lives of any activists and people that you follow. But lastly, closing up, let's go.
Why can your involvement in a movement not be legitimized by the good beliefs that you and your movement express that are a further perfection of an historical figure's view that was tarnished by something bad, but that you have refined to be better with time?
Yeah, so number one, because schools indoctrinate these beliefs through nationalism, through history textbooks, and through the writings that are done by these victors. Number two, because many of these individuals also want people to turn to and also idolize, and therefore they grow up believing that they can also be like these people. Like Obama's a historical figure. I want to be like Obama. That's also a good thing. And also participation in these movements also relies on people that they can also go back to, like the leader of your organization and the organization leader before that. All of this is also historical, and therefore it still applies. Lastly, legacies surround heroes and historical figures and allows them to keep a counter narrative against the worst evils in the future, like rising authoritarianism or populist leaders. It is no surprise that when Duterte rose to power in the Philippines, the first legacies that he tarnished were those of Emilio Aguinaldo and Andres Bonifacio, our first national heroes, because they were also, according to him, also corrupt and also morally evil. This is exactly what divides these movements now and makes it even worse. I give you more examples. Examples are extensions. That's why we win at closing gov. Why did we beat opening gov lastly? We think what David talks about in our speech is not just the political differences like opening government talked about, but the moral judgments and how people assign blame to these individuals. We talk about the following. Number one, the political capital becomes more and more personal and covering these, scandalizing these individuals and making it harder for you to associate it because it is disproportionate. But number two, the intentions discredit the legacies of these movements and also the people that support it. For all this and more, because we talked about why legacies matter for movements and why it allows people to try as much as possible to coalesce to an ideal that is better than these people very proud propose.
We thank that speaker very much for those remarks, and this House is very pleased to recognize the final speaker of the debate, the opposition whip. Hear, hear.
Is this audible? I'm going to do three things in this speech. First, I'm going to take care of CG's extension, explain why it doesn't stand. Second, I'm going to talk about how Trenton's extension actually deals with the real comparatives in this debate and takes it over all the top half. And lastly, I'm going to do more direct responses to opening government. Let's deal with CG first. The first thing that Luigi says is that legacies must always be tarnished. You're going to focus on the very personal diaries of George Washington. You go into the very specific things that make individuals intrinsically evil, and this leads to a total tarnishing that damages individuals. This misses the way that different sources of information interact with individuals to form a legacy cohesively. So sure, you look at the personal diaries of George Washington, you look at the personal diaries of Jose Rizal, but the information that comes out of that interacts with existing public sentiment and existing understanding of the good they did. So yes, these personal diaries do reveal things about them that were bad, but these don't completely negate everything. They work in interaction with existing perceptions of good that these people did to get a more nuanced picture and an equilibrium picture that they did some good and some bad, which is why that's not true. And I think the example of Hitler and Japan bombing being completely uncontroversial is very disingenuous of Luigi, because this is not the examples that our case was based on. Our case was based on instances of things like colonialism, where it was very uncontroversial in the societies that perpetuated it that this was good. In Britain, this was seen as the white man's burden to go and save all of Africa, to bring Christianity to them, to justify it. This was seen, and Columbus might have been controversial for the Native Americans. He sure as well wasn't controversial to the settlers who wanted that land and the European monarchs that sent him there. These are people that are definitely controversial. That doesn't work on their side. Their main extension that therefore remains standing is that you pick away at the legitimacy of leaders of social movements and therefore discredit these movements. There's a number of problems with this that Trenton points out that get no response. Firstly, this is not very possible to be done by the conservative elite that might choose to do so. What are the conservatives going to say? These individuals were anti-Semitic, so we must oppose them. That does nothing except draw hypocrisy and criticism on them for their own historical figures being racist as well. There's no way for conservative elites to weaponize this narrative against other individuals without also bouncing back on them in a way that makes sure that this equilibrium doesn't happen. But even if it does happen, I would argue that this is somewhat of a good thing, because what happens when historical figures have some level of tarnishing and some level of legacy suffering is that social movements adapt to focus on the aspects of that figure that were good, but abandon the aspects of that figure were bad. So Luigi, yeah, I agree with you. Obama might be great, but you could be a better Obama by not bombing the shit out of the Middle East. I think having some things that are suffering your legacy means that you get the good things, but don't get the bad things. That takes CG's main harm of decreasing the capacity of social movements to work out of this debate. And their argument about tarnishing requires a totalized tarnishing that ignores the interaction effects that occur when these evil aspects interact with existing public zeitgeist that says these individuals are good. But lastly, I just want to point out, like, politically incentive-wise, this is obviously not going to be a total tarnishing, right? Let's say you have a bunch of protests by saying these people did really bad shit, and a bunch of guys that says, well, they still did some good. The solution is not complete tarnishment. The solution is likely to be a middle ground solution where you're like, fine, we acknowledge that this guy did some bad shit. We agree to put that in the history curriculum. Not that the history curriculum is going to be completely reformed to say that this guy did no good. There's going to be an equilibrium where both sides have to agree to what then becomes part of the public legacy of these individuals. That is why that is out of the debate. Let's then move on to Trenton's extension and why that wins. Before that, I'll take closing.
The claim that you problematize is that they look hypocritical, but as we already established, people in power can take the hit. Their goal isn't to look good, it's to beat you down and weaken the faith of the specific group of people that already care about legacy.
Right, but they lose their position of privilege when they lend credence to the argument that you're using, right? They only have that position of privilege because they can just deny that argument. If they validate that argument, then that has to be symmetrically applied back on them. That's why that POI doesn't land. What does Trenton demonstrate in extension? Trenton demonstrates a few things. He says that given that these people committed actions that are obviously immoral right now, absent some level of intervention by the state in creating museums and historical curricula, in creating things that preserve the legacy of these individuals, there would have been a natural tarnishing of their image. Given there would have been a natural tarnishing of their image, to prevent a suffering of the legacy, there are specific mechanisms that states and groups must take so that the legacy does not suffer. He outlines the only three possible ways that this can occur. The first one is erasure, where you simply don't talk about the past, you alienate individuals, and you actively condemn them. This reduces awareness of past harms, makes people feel terrible, makes people feel like they don't have a spot in society, that people have erased the harms that they have done on them. That is an active harm. It furthermore prevents any discussion of things that could have happened to help them, because people no longer understand that the harm was visited. And by the way, this also takes out all of open government's analysis on post-colonial nations, right? Because just because there's a public legacy that says this guy was perfectly good, doesn't mean that the ethnic groups that were actually harmed by them forget those stories. Just because the national history curricula doesn't tell you that your entire village was massacred, doesn't mean your village elders don't tell you that historically this government has massacred us, right? Public legacy is different from the stories that marginalized communities might tell themselves, and that drives wedges between individuals. That's why, like, Aditya's disingenuous example about Kenya doesn't work. The Kikuyu and Kalenjin have always been sparring even after Kenyatta's demise. That is the status quo they're talking about. The second problem is rationalization. You have to rationalize the moral evil by saying it was worth it, right? This wasn't that bad. It was our white man's burden to go and civilize Africa. We gave India the railroads. We developed Singapore. That means that people don't understand the moral evils that were done and say that they have no obligation to the status quo that makes it impossible to do anything better. Opening.
Op Bench, without mechanization, asserts that Gov defends worshipping historical figures. We can explain immoral actions with nuance without the legacy holistically suffering, but even if this is true, their mob mentality means you focus all your resources on performative action and tear down the institutions good people built.
So interesting assertion. Our entire extension is based on how you try and explain them not suffering, right? So the two mechanisms I just demonstrated explain why that nuance is not possible, and you engage in moral evils that take away individuals' capacity to get redress right now, but also feel a part of that society. The last one, and this is the most generous, is that you teach the moral trade-off. But the problem there that Trenton identifies is that you tell people that a sufficient moral good is enough to redeem you of any moral evil that you might commit. It doesn't matter that you had slaves. It doesn't matter that you committed colonialism, because you helped the country. You helped preserve the race. And this is incredibly important and harmful, right? Because not only does it mean that people's experiences are marginalized, but it frames the way people think in the status quo. Think about this. You learn about historical figures in museums. You learn about them in class. And when this moral trade-off is taught to you, you internalize that that way of assessing individuals. It makes you think about the way you assess people right now. So you're like, I don't care that Trump detaining kids at the border is an absolute moral evil that can't be tolerated, because him being a good Christian man is a sufficient moral good to demonstrate it. And this is an internalization that happens your entire life and applies to the way you view individuals. Why does this beat opening opposition? Opening opposition talks about rallying points, right? But that rallying point is contingent on having a successful movement that reforms individuals. They're contingent on this oppression being successful. Ours is analytically prior, because it doesn't matter that the movement is actively successful at generating change, but that in the absence of the movement, the attempts to suppress individuals create active harms. So they rely on successful movements. Without any success, the comparative is bad for them. Lastly, quickly on opening government. Trenton has proven to you culpability doesn't matter. We told you the political realm is worse on your side when you can weaponize it. And I've already talked about the example of post-colonial nations. Wedges are driven in your society when the public legacy doesn't match with the narratives that your community itself has had. That's why Kenya has been embraced by co-ethnic competition all this time. The comparative on your side is the one that is worse. At the end of this debate, we are the only team that has impacts regardless of what the comparative is, and that is why we win.